It began on a night colder than memory, when the firelight flickered across two faces that had never seen each other before. One carried the spark of language, the other, the wisdom of ages in silence. When their eyes met, the world itself seemed to hold its breath. That night, deep in the dark heart of prehistory, something ancient ended, and something entirely human began. In the time before memory, when the world still held its breath between ice and flame, there lived a people who moved like shadows across the frozen valleys. They were the children of stone and starlight, born when the earth was young, and the sky sang lullabies to sleeping mountains. The morning came slowly to their valley, creeping across the snow-laden pine boughs like a cautious animal. Mist rose from the hot springs that bubbled up from the earth's deep heart, carrying with it the scent of sulfur and ancient secrets. In this place where winter held dominion for 8 moons of every year, warmth was sacred, fire was life, and breath itself was a prayer offered to whatever gods dwelled in the aurora's dance. Usha knelt by the sacred pool, her broad hands cupping the mineral-rich water that had sustained her people since the Long Mothers first found this hidden sanctuary. Her face, weathered by countless storms and graced with the strong bones of her lineage, reflected in the dark surface like a moon glimpsing itself in a midnight lake. Around her throat hung a necklace of mammoth ivory and amber, each bead carved by her grandmother's grandmother, each one holding a story older than the glaciers that crowned the distant peaks. The water tasted of earth and time. As she drank, she could feel it joining the river of life that flowed through all things, from the roots of the great pines to the breath of the sleeping bears, from the pulse of the springs to the rhythm of her own heart. This was the first teaching of her people. All water returns to the source, all breath returns to the pate. Wind, all souls return to the dreaming. Behind her, the clan was stirring. The hide-covered shelters that nestled against the cliff face like birds' nests began to exhale thin streams of smoke as hearth fires were coaxed back to life. Children emerged, their faces soft with sleep and wonder, their small hands already knowing the motions their ancestors had performed for 1,000 generations. The gathering of kindling, the feeding of flames, the careful tending of the embers that must never die. Old Makan, his beard white as winter wolf fur, emerged from the largest shelter carrying a bundle of dried herbs. His eyes, clouded with age, but still bright with wisdom, found Asha beside the pool. Without words, for much of their communication flowed beneath the surface of language, he nodded toward the eastern ridge where the sun was beginning to paint the snow in shades of coral and gold. Today was the day of smoke speaking, when the clans scattered across the vast wilderness would send their messages rising into the clear air, telling of births and deaths, of the movement of herds, of the health of the sacred fires. It was a day that connected all the people across impossible distances, weaving them together with threads of meaning that rose toward the sky like offerings. Asha's daughter, Nala, approached with quiet steps, her young face serious with responsibility. At 14 winters, she was old enough to tend the message fire, young enough to still see the spirits that danced in the flames. Her hands, so like Asha's but unmarked by years of work, carried a birch bark container filled with the special moss that burned with sweet-smelling smoke. "The wind is good today, Mother," Nala whispered, using the old words that tasted of honey and pine resin. "It carries toward the sunset lands." Together, they climbed the worn path that spiraled up the cliff face to the signal platform their ancestors had built from carefully fitted stones. Each step had been walked by, countless feet, worn smooth by generations of smoke speakers who had carried their people's words skyward. The platform itself was a perfect circle, its center marked by a firebowl carved from a single block of granite, its rim decorated with the spiral patterns that spoke of wind and water, of the endless turning of seasons. As Nala prepared the sacred fire, Asha gazed out over the valley that held all her world. Below, the thermal springs sent their eternal steam toward the sky. The shelters of her clan hugged the cliff base like sleeping animals. The food caches, built high to keep them safe from bears, dotted the valley floor like prayer cairns. Everything was exactly as it should be, as it had always been, as it would always be. But even as this thought formed, something shifted in the quality of the air. A breath that didn't quite belong to the wind, a silence that fell between one heartbeat and the next, as if the valley itself were listening for something it had never heard before. Asha's hand went instinctively to the ivory pendant at her throat, her fingers finding the familiar grooves worn by her grandmother's touch. The smoke began to rise from Nala's carefully tended fire, carrying its message of life and continuance toward the vast sky. Yet somewhere, in a direction she could not name, Asha felt the approach of something that would change everything. The sun climbed higher, the smoke rose straight and true, and the day proceeded exactly as countless days before it. But the feeling remained, that sense of standing at the edge of a great precipice, looking into a future that stretched away like an unmapped wilderness. As mother and daughter descended from the signal platform, their daily ritual complete, neither spoke of the strangeness in the air. But that night, as Asha banked the hearthfire for sleep, she found herself looking longer than usual into the glowing coals, as if searching for visions of what was to come. In the embers, shapes seemed to dance, shadows and forms that might have been memories, or might have been prophecies. And just before sleep claimed her, she could have sworn she heard, carried on the wind that sighed through the valley, the sound of footsteps that belonged to no one she knew. 3 days' march to the south, where the valley narrowed into a canyon scarred by ancient floods, another fire burned against the darkness. This flame danced differently, hungrier, more restless, fed by wood, gathered from farther and farther afield, as the band that tended it moved ever northward into unknown lands. Kalen crouched beside this fire, his lean frame casting angular shadows on the canyon walls. Where Asha's people were carved from stone and patience, he was made of wind and lightning, his dark eyes always searching the horizon for what lay beyond. In his hands he turned a piece of flint, its edges sharp enough to cut through hide, through bone, through the very fabric of the world, if necessary. His people called themselves the Wanderers, though they had many names for themselves depending on the season, the terrain, the game they hunted, the dreams their shamans received. They were a river people, a people of movement, always flowing towards some distant sea of possibility. Where Asha's clan had claimed their valley and made it home for generations beyond counting, Kalen's people carried home with them like a song, like a story that was retold around each new fire in each new place. "The smoke speaks," said Jira, emerging from the darkness beyond the firelight. She was their far-seer, a woman whose eyes could read the land like a vast book written in stone and star. Her hair was adorned with feathers from birds that nested in places so distant their names were legend. In her hand she carried a staff, topped with the skull of a cave bear, its empty sockets seeming to watch the fire with ancient hunger. "What does it tell?" Kalen asked, though part of him already knew. For 3 days now, they had seen the smoke signals rising from the northern valleys organized, purposeful, speaking in a language none of them understood. The signs of people who were not people like them. "They are many," Jira said, settling beside the fire with the careful grace of one who had read countless terrains, survived countless winters. Their fires burn in the old places, the deep places. They know the land as we know the path of the stars. Around them, the rest of the band stirred in their sleep. Furs. 37 souls in all, counting the children who rode in hide carriers, and the elders whose wisdom was worth the slowness of their steps. They had been traveling for 2 full cycles of the moon, following herds and water, and the strange pull that drew them always northward, into the teeth of the ice, towards something none of them could name. "And what do the bones tell?" Kalen asked. For Jira was not only a far-seer, but a speaker to spirits, one who could cast the carved pieces of sacred animals, and read in their fall the shape of things to come. Without answering, she reached into the leather pouch at her side, and withdrew 7 small bones, each carved with symbols that seemed to shift in the firelight. She whispered words in the old tongue, words that tasted of blood and honey, of distance and desire, and let the bones fall onto the patch of swept earth between them. For a long moment, she studied the pattern they made. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of prophecy. "Change comes," she said simply. "The bones show a splitting, a branching, like when a river meets another river, but whether they will flow together or fight for the same channel." She gestured at the scattered bones, their meaning as cryptic as the shadows that danced beyond the fire's reach. Kalen felt something stir in his chest, not fear, Exactly. But its wilder cousin, anticipation. His people were seekers, explorers, driven by a hunger for the new that was as fundamental as their need for fire and food. They had crossed deserts where no rain fell for years, climbed mountains that scraped the belly of the sky, followed coastlines to the very edge of the world. Always, they had been alone in their wandering, the only people beneath the vast dome of stars. But now, if the smoke signal spoke truly, they were not alone. How far? He asked. 2 days, perhaps 3. They are in the deep valley, where the warm springs rise. A good place. A strong place. Jira's eyes reflected the firelight, like chips of obsidian. A place worth holding. The words hung in the air between them, laden with possibility and threat. Kalen's people had never needed to hold anything. They took what the land offered and moved on when it had no more to give. But these others, these smoke speakers, they had claimed a place and made it theirs across generations. What would happen when the river of wanderers met the mountain of the settled? Around the fire, one of the children whimpered in sleep, and his mother's soft humming rose to comfort him. It was an old song, one that spoke of journeys and homecomings, of paths that led through darkness toward light. Kalen had heard it sung around countless fires, in countless places, always the same melody, but with words that changed like water, adapting to wherever they found themselves. Tonight, though, the song seemed different. Sadder, perhaps, or more urgent, as if it knew, as all their songs knew, that the time of easy wandering was drawing to a close. We go north, Kalen said finally, his decision crystallizing like ice forming on still water. We find these smoke speakers. We learn what they are. Jira nodded, gathering up her bones and returning them to their pouch. And, if they are enemies, then we become the storm. His hand moved to the obsidian blade at his side, its edge honed to the sharpness of winter wind. And if they are friends? Then perhaps, she said, standing and shouldering her bare skull staff, we learn what it means to rest. As the fire burned down to coals, Kalen remained beside it, staring into the glowing heart of the flames. Tomorrow, they would break camp before dawn, following the ancient paths that wound between the stone teeth of the canyon. Tomorrow they would begin the final approach to whatever destiny awaited them in the Valley of Warm Springs. But tonight, in the space between sleep and waking, he felt the weight of all the tomorrows that might be. In the fire's heart, he saw faces that were not faces, heard voices speaking words not yet invented. And in the wind that sighed through the canyon, he could have sworn he heard the sound of another people's songs, drifting down from the north like promises or warnings. The night deepened, the fire died to embers, and the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance. Somewhere in the darkness, change was moving toward them all, with the inevitability of seasons, with the certainty of dawn following night. And in that darkness, something was watching. On the night, when 2 moons would rise, though neither Asher nor Kalen yet knew this impossibility awaited them, the dreams began. Asher woke first, gasping as if she had been drowning in sleep itself. Her shelter, woven from willow branches and sealed with mud and moss, felt suddenly fragile as an eggshell. Outside, the eternal murmur of the hot springs continued, but underneath that familiar sound lay something else, a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the very concept of sound. She rose without waking her daughter, who slept curled beside the banked fire like a young fox in its den. The hide flap of their dwelling whispered as she pushed through it into the night air that bit at her skin with teeth of frost and starlight. The valley spread before her, silver-touched by moonlight that seemed too bright, too cold. Every shadow appeared deeper than it should be. Every familiar landmark, somehow transformed into something she Lakens had never seen before. The standing stones that marked the burial ground of her ancestors looked like fingers reaching toward a sky that pressed down with unfamiliar weight. But it was not the strangeness of the familiar that made her breath catch in her throat. It was the moon itself hanging full and bone-white above the eastern ridge, exactly as it should be. And beside it, climbing from the horizon, like a second eye opening in the darkness, another moon, pale green as glacier ice, casting its own ethereal light across the snow-laden peaks. Usha's hand flew to the ivory pendant at her throat, her fingers tracing the ancient spirals carved there. In all the stories of her people, in all the teaching songs passed down through generations, beyond counting, there had never been a night of two moons. The sky stories spoke of one moon dancing through her phases, of stars that told the time of seasons, of the aurora that carried messages between the earth and the realm of spirits. But two moons. You see it too. The voice belonged to old Makan, though when she turned, she could not find him in the silver-tinged darkness. His words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the very air had learned to speak. What does it mean? She whispered to the night. It means the dreaming has begun. Now she could see him, standing among the burial stones, as if he had always been there, as if he were carved from the same granite that marked the resting places of the long dead. His white beard gleamed like snow in the double moonlight, and his eyes reflected both crescents, one silver, one green, as if he had become a mirror for the impossible sky. "Come," he said, and though he was 50 paces away, his voice sounded as if he spoke directly into her ear. The others are waiting. She found them gathered at the heart of the burial ground, the entire clan standing in a circle around the great stone that marked the grave of the first mother. Children, who should have been deep in sleep, stood with eyes wide as winter lakes. Elders who had not left their shelters in moons stood straight and strong as young trees. All of them stared upward at the twin moons that wheeled through the star-scattered darkness. "It is the sign," said Yeva, the eldest of their line, her voice cracked with age and wonder. "The stories say, when two moons dance in the sky, the world prepares to turn." "Turn to what?" asked Nala, her young voice carrying a tremor that might have been fear or excitement. "To what comes next," old Makan answered. "To what has always been coming." As if summoned by his words, the aurora began to unfurl across the northern sky, but not the familiar green curtains that had danced above their valley since the beginning of memory. This light pulsed with colors that had no names, deep purples that spoke of ocean depths, golds that whispered of distant suns, crimsons that tasted of dreams and longing. And in that impossible light, Asha saw them, figures, moving across the far ridges, silhouetted against the aurora's glow. At first, she thought they were bears, or wolves, or some other night-wandering creatures. But as her eyes adjusted to the strange light of the double moons, she realized they walked upright. They carried fire. They moved with purpose and intelligence. They were people, but not her people. The others, breathed someone she could not tell who, for the voice seemed to come from the very stones beneath their feet. The dreamwalkers, the firebringers from the south. The aurora pulsed brighter, and in its light the distant figures seemed to pause, to turn, to look directly across the impossible distance toward the Valley of Warm Springs. For a moment that stretched like an age, two groups of people stared at each other across a gulf of space and understanding, connected only by the impossible light that painted the sky in colors born from prophecy. Then the aurora faded, the twin moons set behind the mountains, and the normal darkness of a winter night reclaimed the world. But nothing would ever be normal again. 50 leagues to the south, Kalen jerked awake to find his entire band standing in the canyon, their faces turned skyward in wonder and terror. Above them, impossible and beautiful, two moons shed their competing light on stone walls that had stood unchanged since the world's youth. "The dreaming sky," whispered Jira, her bare skull staff clutched so tightly in her hands that her knuckles showed white as bone. "The old songs, they spoke of this." When the sky splits open and shows what lies beyond, Kalen rose without conscious thought, his body moving while his mind struggled to process what his eyes insisted was real. In all his travels, in all the strange lands his people had crossed, he had seen wonders that defied understanding, but two moons hanging in the same sky. This was a wonder that defied the very order of creation. "What does it mean?" asked young Torak, barely old, enough to carry a hunter's spear, his voice small in the vast silence of the canyon. It means, said Jira, her shamanic sight piercing deeper than ordinary vision, that we have reached the place where all paths converge. The aurora bloomed across the northern sky then, painting the canyon walls with light, the color of deep water, of ancient amber, of blood that had never been shed. And in that light, projected against the stone, as if the very rock had learned to hold visions, Kaelin saw them, a people of the deep places, the old places, a people who had claimed the northern valley and made it sing with their presence. They stood in a circle of standing stones, their faces turned toward the same impossible sky, their eyes reflecting the same impossible moons. And one among them, a woman with the strong bones of the mountain folk, with wisdom carved into her features like the sacred spirals carved into stone, looked directly at him, across 50 leagues of wilderness, her gaze finding his as if there were no distance between them at all. In that moment of shared vision, of mutual recognition, Kaelin felt the shape of his destiny crystallize, like water becoming ice. These people, these dwellers in the sacred places, they were not enemies to be conquered, or obstacles to be overcome. They were necessary, essential, a part of something larger than either of their peoples could accomplish alone. The vision faded as the aurora dimmed, leaving only the memory of that distant woman's eyes, and the certainty that their paths were drawing together, like rivers, flowing toward the same sea. North, he said, his voice carrying the weight of irrevocable decision. We go north with the dawn. And if they will not welcome us? Asked Jira. Kaelin looked up at the place where the twin moons had been, now showing only the familiar darkness of a winter night. But the memory of that impossible light lingered, and with it, the knowledge that the world had already changed beyond recognition. Then we will make them understand, he said, that we have all been dreaming the same dream. Around him, his people began to break camp without being asked, their movements sure and purposeful in the darkness. For they too had seen the vision in the aurora light. They too had felt the pull of destiny drawing them northward. By the time the first light of dawn touched the canyon rim, the wanderers had already begun their final journey toward the valley where the smoke speakers waited, where the warm springs bubbled up from the earth's deep heart, where the future was about to unfold, like a flower blooming in reverse, beautiful, terrible, and utterly inevitable. Behind them, the canyon walls still held faint echoes of the aurora's impossible colors, as if the stone itself remembered the night when the sky opened and showed what lay beyond the edge of the known world. The track was wrong in ways that made Asha's spine prickle with ancestral warning. She knelt beside it, in the new snow that had fallen during the night, her experienced eyes reading the story written in displaced earth and pressed ice. Human, but not quite human. The foot that had made this impression was longer than those of her people, narrower, with toes that gripped the ground differently than any foot she had ever known. 5 of them, she murmured to her hunting companion, Jorik, a stocky man whose skill at reading signs was legendary among their clan, moving north through the night. They know the land, but not our land. Jorik crouched beside her, his weathered face creased with concentration. His people had been hunters in this valley for more generations than the stars had names, and his eyes could read stories in disturbed snow that others would pass by as random marks. But these tracks told a story that belonged to no tradition he knew. See here, he said, pointing to a place where the snow had been disturbed in a perfect circle. They made fire, but look at the pattern of the ash, the way the stones are arranged. This is not how fire should be built. Asha nodded, understanding, flooding through her, like cold water. Every people had their own way with flame, the sacred arrangements that honored the spirit of fire, the practical configurations that best served their needs. But this fire had been built according to different knowledge, different traditions, different gods. How far ahead? She asked, though part of her already knew the answer from the depth of the impressions, the crispness of the edges. Half a day, maybe less. Jorik's hand moved instinctively to the bone-hafted knife at his side. They are moving toward the sacred springs. The sacred springs. The heart of their territory, the the source of all life in their valley, the place where the first mothers had received the original visions that shaped their people. If these strangers reach the springs, we follow, Asha decided, her voice carrying the authority she had earned through 40 winters of survival in the harsh lands. But carefully, like shadows, we learn what they are before they know we exist. They moved through the forest with the fluid silence that was the birthright of their people, following the strange tracks through stands of ancient pine and across meadows where the snow lay unmarked except for the delicate impressions of winter birds. With each step, the trail grew fresher, the story clearer. The strangers were organized, disciplined. They moved in single file, with one taking point, 2 flanking, 2 guarding the rear. Warriors, then, or at least people who thought like warriors. But there was something else in the tracks, something that spoke of purposes beyond mere hunting or raiding. At midday, they found the second fire site, and here, the story became more complex. The strangers had stopped for longer than a brief rest. They had prepared food, fish, from the smell that still lingered in the cold air. They had crafted tools, leaving behind chips of worked stone that spoke of skill and patience. And they had drawn symbols in the packed earth around their fire, careful spirals and zigzag patterns that seemed almost familiar, as if they were a dialect of the sacred language Asha's people used in their own ceremonies. They are not raiders, Jorik said, studying the symbols with the respect due to any working of spiritual significance. These marks, they speak of reverence, of seeking. Seeking what? Asha asked, though in her heart she thought she already knew. The same thing we all seek, came a voice from behind them. Understanding. They spun, weapons half drawn, to find old Makan emerging from between the trees as if he had always been there. His white beard glittered with ice crystals, and his eyes held the deep knowing that came to those who had learned to listen to the land's own voice. How long have you been following us? Asha asked, her heart still racing from the surprise of his appearance. I have not been following you, he replied, with the gentle humor of the very wise. I have been following them, just as they, in their own way, have been following us. What do you mean? Instead of answering directly, old Makan led them to a fallen log that commanded a view of the valley below. In the distance, thin streams of smoke rose from their clan's fires, marking home with grey pillars against the blue sky. But there was another column of smoke, thinner and farther off, rising from somewhere near the boundary stones that marked the edge of their traditional territory. They made camp there last night, he said, just beyond the markers, close enough to see our smoke, far enough to show respect. Respect? Ray. Respect? Jorik's hand had not left his knife hilt. How can you speak of respect from people who trespass on sacred ground? Because, old Makan said, settling onto the log with the careful movements of age, they have not trespassed. They have stopped. They have waited. They have sent signs. What signs? The old man pointed toward the distant smoke. Look closely. See how it rises. Asha stared at the faraway column until her eyes watered from the effort. Gradually, she began to see what old Makan's sharper sight had already detected. The smoke did not rise straight and steady, as cooking smoke should. Instead, it pulsed brief, controlled releases that formed a pattern against the sky. Signal smoke, she breathed. They are trying to speak to us. And what do they say? Old Makan was quiet for a long moment, his ancient eyes reading meaning in the distant signals. When he finally spoke, his voice carried wonder and something that might have been fear. They say, "We come in peace. We bring gifts. We seek the wisdom of the deep places. We ask permission to approach." The words hung in the cold air, like visible things, reshaping everything Asha thought she understood about the situation. These were not raiders or wanderers, stumbling blindly into their territory. These were people who knew something of proper behavior, of the protocols that governed meetings between different peoples. How do they know our signal speech? Jorik asked. Perhaps, said old Makan, rising from the log with renewed purpose in his movements, it is not so different from their own. Perhaps all peoples, in their depths, speak the same language. As they made their way back toward the settlement, following paths worn smooth by countless generations of their ancestors. Asha found herself thinking about the symbols the strangers had drawn in the earth, the spirals and zigzags that seemed almost familiar, the fire pattern that followed a different tradition, but served the same essential purpose. Behind them, the tracks they had been following continued northward, toward the sacred springs, toward the heart of everything their people held dear. But now those tracks seemed less like a threat, and more like possibility. The footprints of people, who might be different from them in form and custom, but who shared something deeper, something that transcended the boundaries of clan and territory and blood. That night, as the clan gathered around their central fire to hear what the hunters had discovered, Old Macan stood and spoke words that would echo in memory long after the snows had melted and the seasons had turned. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice carrying across the circle of listening faces, "we will answer their smoke with our own. We will tell them, 'Come, come, and be welcome. Come and let us see what the meeting of two peoples might bring to the world.'" In the darkness beyond the firelight, the wind carried the scent of distant smoke, the sound of unknown voices, the promise of change that could no longer be held back by walls of tradition or fear. And somewhere in that darkness, destiny continued its patient approach, wearing the faces of strangers, who might yet become something more. The night stretched itself thin as old hide, holding its breath between one age and the next. In the valley of the warm springs, Asha sat vigil by the sacred fire, feeding it carefully chosen pieces of cedar and pine, each stick placed with the reverence due to an ancient ritual. The flames spoke in their old language of spark and shadow, telling stories that only those who had learned to listen could understand. Around the fire, her people waited. Not all of them, the very young and very old, slept in the shelters, guarded by those who would remain behind when tomorrow brought its inevitable changes. But the adults, the decision-makers, the ones who would face whatever came with the dawn, they sat in the circle of firelight and watched the flames devour fuel and air and transform them into light. "Are you afraid?" asked Nala, her daughter's voice barely more than a whisper in the crackling silence. Asha considered the question with the thoroughness it deserved. Fear was not a simple thing among her people. There was the quick fear that kept you alive when facing a cave bear or crossing treacherous ice that was good fear, necessary fear. There was the deep fear that came from knowing winter would outlast your stores, or that the hunting would fail, or that the springs might one day run dry. That was wisdom, fear, the kind that made you prepare and plan and respect the forces that could unmake you. But there was also the fear that came from not knowing, from standing at the edge of a cliff and being unable to see what lay at the bottom. That was the fear that could paralyze or transform, depending on how you chose to face it. "I am afraid," she said finally, "but afraid the way water is afraid of becoming ice, or the way spring is afraid of becoming summer. It is the fear of change, which is also the fear of growth." Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, the same configurations that had guided her people, since the first mothers had learned to read the sky's stories. But tonight, even the familiar stars seemed different, charged with significance, as if they too were waiting for something unprecedented to unfold. Jorik emerged from the darkness beyond the fire's reach, returning from the watchpost where he had been monitoring the stranger's signals. His face, normally as easy to read as tracks in fresh snow, showed the complexity of someone wrestling with contradictory emotions. "They have made their final fire," he reported. 1 league south, at the speaking stones where the old boundaries were marked. Their smoke carries the scent of offerings, burning herbs, sacred woods. They prepare as we prepare, and their signals, they ask again for permission to approach. They offer to come unarmed, to bring gifts, to speak under the protection of the peace fire. He paused, his weathered features creased with uncertainty. "They know our customs, Asha. Not perfectly, but well enough. As if what?" prompted old Markan, who had been so still beside the fire that he might have been mistaken for one of the stones that ringed it. "As if they learned them from the same source we did. As if there was a time, long ago, when all peoples shared the same knowledge." The words settled into the space around the fire like stones thrown into deep water, sending ripples of implication, through the gathered clan. Among Asha's people, there were stories, old stories, the kind told only during the deepest part of winter, when the world outside seemed more dream than reality. Stories that spoke of a time before the ice, when all the peoples of the earth had been one people, sharing the same fires, speaking the same tongues, honoring the same spirits. But those were just stories, weren't they? The dreams, said Yeva suddenly, her ancient voice carrying the weight of revelation. For 3 nights now, I have dreamed of a great gathering, people of many faces but one heart, sharing fire and food, and the deep knowledge that binds all living things together. Around the circle, others began to nod, their faces showing the recognition of shared experience. The dreams had come to many of them, varying in detail but consistent in their essential message. Change approached not as destroyer, but as restorer, bringing together what had long been separated. And what do the dreams tell us we should do? Asked Jorik, his hunter's pragmatism warring with the growing sense that they stood at the threshold of something larger than mere survival. Before anyone could answer, a new sound cut through the night, distant but clear, carried on the wind that sighed down from the high peaks. Singing, voices raised in harmony, weaving melodies that were foreign yet somehow familiar, like a half-remembered lullaby from childhood. The clan fell silent, straining to catch every note of the strange song. It spoke of journeys and homecomings, of paths that led through darkness toward light, of the endless dance between seeking and finding. And underneath the melody, like the deep bass note of the earth itself, ran themes that matched their own sacred songs, their own ceremonies of greeting and welcome. They honor the night, old Makan said softly. They sing to the spirits of place, asking permission to be here, offering themselves to whatever judgment the land might make. As if in response to their distant song, something stirred in the forest around them. Not the movement of animals. This was something else, something that belonged to the borderland between the seen and unseen. The spirits of place, perhaps, drawn by music that spoke to the deeper currents of existence. Asha felt it then, the certainty that had been building in her heart throughout the long night. Tomorrow would bring change, yes, but change of the kind that healed rather than wounded, that completed rather than destroyed. The strangers who waited beyond the boundary stones were not enemies but missing pieces of a pattern that had been broken long ago. We will go to them, she said, her voice carrying the authority of decision made. At first light, we will meet these singers, these fire builders, these people who know our customs and share our dreams. We will see what the joining of 2 peoples might make possible. Around the circle, heads nodded in agreement, fear transforming into anticipation, uncertainty becoming resolve. They would face the dawn not as victims of change but as participants in a great restoration. The singing from the south continued, weaving its way through the darkness like a river of sound, carrying messages of hope and greeting, and the patient faith that bridges could be built across any gulf of difference. And in the sacred fire, at the heart of their circle, the flames danced higher, as if kindled by the breath of possibility itself. As the first pale hint of dawn began to show above the eastern peaks, old Makan rose and spoke words that would be remembered as long as stories were told around winter fires. When the sun rises fully, we will walk south to the speaking stones. We will carry fire and gifts and open hearts. We will meet these others not as strangers but as the separated parts of one great whole, finally coming home to each other. The fire crackled its agreement, sending sparks spiraling up toward the lightning sky. And in the distance, a wolf howled once, then twice, as if to mark not the end of an age, but the beginning of something entirely new. The last of the night shadows began their retreat before the advancing light, and with them fled the last of the fears that change meant only loss. For in the growing light of dawn, it became possible to see that some changes were like the return of spring after winter, like the blooming of flowers that had waited through long seasons of snow for their proper time. Today would be such a change. Today would be such a blooming. And in the valley where the warm springs bubbled up from the earth's deep heart, 2 peoples prepared to meet their destiny in the growing light of what would forever after be remembered as the morning when the world became larger, richer, and infinitely more full of hope than anyone had dared to imagine. They came to the speaking stones with the first full light, when shadows still stretched long across the snow, but the sun had climbed high enough to paint the world in shades of gold and amber. Asha led her people along the ancient path, her steps measured and deliberate, each footfall placed with the reverence due to ground that had witnessed countless meetings between earth and sky, between past and future. Behind her walked 12 of her clan's strongest, carrying gifts wrapped in ceremonial furs, carved bone tools, pouches of healing herbs, strings of amber beads that had been worn smooth by generations of mothers' fingers. But the greatest gift they carried was invisible, the willingness to see what stood before them, without the filter of fear. The speaking stones rose from the earth like frozen giants, each one taller than 3 people standing, their surfaces carved with spirals and zigzags that spoke in the old language of wind and water, of the endless turning of seasons. They had been placed here by the first mothers, marking the boundary between the known and unknown, the place where different worlds could meet in safety. And at their base, arranged in a careful half-circle, waited the others. Asha's breath caught in her throat. She had thought she was prepared for this moment, had spent the night imagining what the strangers might look like, how they might move, what she might see in their eyes. But imagination was a pale thing compared to reality. They were people, unmistakably, undeniably people. They breathed, they watched, they shifted weight from foot to foot with the nervous energy of creatures balanced on the edge of flight or fight. But they were people shaped by different dreams, carved by different landscapes, polished by different stars, tall. That was the first difference that struck her. Where her people were built like the stones themselves, broad and solid, and enduring these, others rose like the pine trees, reaching toward the sky, with an elegance that spoke of movement, of distance, of horizons that stretched beyond seeing. Their faces were narrower, their eyes set deeper beneath brows that shadowed their thoughts. Their skin bore the weathering of many suns, many winds, spoke of journeys across landscapes she could barely imagine. And their hair dark as winter water, adorned with feathers and beads and small bones that caught the light and scattered it like captured stars. But it was their stillness that moved her most. They stood with the patience of hunters, the watchfulness of prey, the dignity of those who knew they faced a moment that would echo through generations, yet unborn. Like her own people, they understood the weight of this morning, the fragility of whatever might grow from this first meeting. At their center stood one who was clearly their speaker, their leader, their equivalent to herself. Tall, even among the tall ones, his lean frame draped in furs that spoke of successful hunts in foreign lands. His eyes dark as deep water, bright as the first star found hers across the space between them, and held her gaze with an intensity that made her feel as if she were seeing herself reflected in still water. This was Kaelin. She knew it without being told, the way she knew which way the wind would turn before it turned, the way she knew winter's approach, in the smell of the air. This was the one she had seen in the aurora light, the one who had shared her vision of 2 moons dancing across an impossible sky. For a long moment that stretched like a held breath, the 2 groups simply stood and looked at each other. No words passed between them, none were needed. This was the looking that came before speaking, the assessment that came before trust, the recognition that came before understanding. Asha felt her people's tension like a physical thing, a tightening of muscles, a quickening of breath. Jorik's hand rested on his knife hilt, not in threat but in readiness. Nala pressed close to her mother's side, her young eyes wide with wonder and fear in equal measure. Old Makan stood slightly apart, his ancient face serene with the patience of one who had waited long for this moment to arrive. On the other side of the invisible line that separated them, she could see similar tensions, similar readiness. The others held themselves like water about to overflow its banks, contained for now, but ready to flow in whatever direction circumstances might channel them. And then Kaelin smiled. It was the smallest possible expression, barely more than a softening around his eyes, a slight lifting at the corners of his mouth. But in that smile, Asha saw something that spoke to the deepest part of her understanding: recognition. Not of her face, for they had never met, but of something deeper, the recognition of one spirit looking into another and finding not strangeness but familiarity. She smiled back, just as carefully, just as softly. And in that exchange of small expressions, the morning changed. The tension didn't disappear, it was too profound for that, too necessary, but it shifted, becoming anticipation rather than fear, curiosity rather than suspicion. Kaelin took a step forward. Just one step, but it carried the weight of intention, of deliberate choice to move toward rather than away. He kept his hands visible, his movements slow and clear, his expression open as sky. Asha matched his movement, taking her own step into the space between them. The snow crunched softly under her feet, and somewhere in the distance a raven called, its voice carrying across the morning air like a benediction. Another step. Another. The space between them shrank but somehow grew larger at the same time, expanding with possibility, with the magnitude of what they were attempting. Two peoples who had never known of each other's existence, reaching across the gulf of difference to touch whatever common ground might exist. When they were close enough to see the frost of each other's breath, close enough to catch the scent of unfamiliar herbs and oils that spoke of different customs, different lands, they stopped. Kaelin's people carried the smell of distant places, sage and cedar from warmer lands, salt from shores she had never seen, the musk of animals that lived beyond the reach of eternal winter. But underneath the foreign scents lay something familiar, the smell of wood smoke and well-tanned hides, the metallic tang of worked stone, the warm animal scent of humans who had survived by skill and strength, and the bonds that held families together. They were different, but not so different as to be incomprehensible. Kaelin raised his hands slowly, palms outward, fingers spread in the universal gesture of peace. His eyes never left hers, and in their depths, she could see the same mixture of wonder and wariness that she felt in her own heart. Asha mirrored his gesture, her broad palms facing his narrow ones across the arm's length of space that separated them. For a moment they stood like that, hands almost touching, breathing the same cold air, sharing the same impossible morning. And in that moment, before words or gifts or the complications of understanding, there was simply recognition, human to human, heart to heart. Two souls acknowledging each other across the vast loneliness of existence, saying without words, "You are real, you are here, you are like me in the ways that matter most." Behind them, their peoples watched and waited, holding their breath for whatever would come next. Above them, the sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the shadows, bathing the speaking stones in light that made every carved spiral glow like living things. The moment stretched and deepened, becoming something that would live in memory long after the snows had melted and the seasons had turned. The moment when two branches of humanity, separated by distance and time and the endless accident of wandering, reached toward each other and touched the possibility of becoming one people again. But moments, however profound, must end. And as the sun reached its full strength and the morning moved toward midday, Kaelin lowered his hands and spoke the first word that would bridge the gap between their worlds or begin the process of tearing them apart. He spoke, and everything changed. The word Kaelin spoke was older than language, deeper than meaning. It was the sound water makes when it meets stone, the whisper wind makes through winter grass. But shaped by human lips, carrying human intention, it became something more, an offering, a question, a key turned in a lock that had been sealed since the world's youth. "A tash," he said, his voice soft as snow falling on still water. "Fire," Asha's breath caught, not because she understood the word, its shape was foreign to her tongue, its sound unlike anything in her people's speech, but because of what he did as he spoke it. Kaelin reached into the fur wrappings at his chest, movements slow and deliberate, his eyes never leaving hers. From a carefully wrapped pouch, he withdrew a bundle of dry grass and bark, tinder that had been prepared with the care reserved for sacred things. Then, with the fluid motions of one who had performed this ritual countless times, he produced two pieces of stone, flint and iron pyrite, the marriage of elements that could birth the gift no human could live without. He knelt in the snow between them, still speaking in his soft, liquid tongue. Words Asher couldn't understand but whose meaning was written in every gesture. Watch, learn, receive what I offer. The first strike of stone against stone sent a small spark into the waiting tinder. It caught, glowed, began to smoke. Kalen cupped his hands around the tiny coal, breathing life into it with the patience of one who knew that fire, like trust, could not be rushed. Behind Asher, she heard Jorik's sharp intake of breath. Firemaking was sacred among all peoples, but each had their own methods, their own rituals. To see the mysteries performed by foreign hands, according to foreign ways, was to witness something both familiar and alien. The tinder caught. Small flames licked upward, hungry for fuel. From another pouch, Kalen produced twigs and bark, feeding the growing fire with the care of a mother nursing a newborn. The flames strengthened, reached higher, began to cast warmth into the cold air between them. And then, in a gesture that would be remembered as long as stories were told around winter fires, Kalen lifted the burning bundle and held it out toward Asher. The offer hung in the air like something visible, like a bridge built of light and warmth spanning the gap between their worlds. Fire freely given, the most precious gift one human could offer another, offered without price, without demand for payment. Asher felt her people's tension spike to near breaking. Fire was life, but fire was also danger. In the wrong hands, it could consume rather than nurture, destroy rather than sustain. To accept flame from strangers was to trust them with the power to burn down everything you held dear. But to refuse was to reject the deepest gesture of human generosity, to turn away from the gift that had made civilization possible, to deny the fundamental kinship that connected all who walked upright beneath the stars. Slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird, Asher extended her own hands toward the offered flame. Kalen's eyes, those dark pools that seemed to hold depths she might spend lifetimes exploring, watched her approach with an intensity that made the air between them shimmer like heat haze. Their fingers nearly touched as she took the burning bundle from his hands. The warmth of the flame was nothing compared to the warmth of the brief contact. Skin against skin, the first physical connection between their peoples, in however many thousands of years they had wandered apart. The fire settled into her palms like a living thing, familiar yet strange. It burned with the same essential nature as any fire, but it carried the breath of foreign lands, the essence of different traditions, the accumulated knowledge of people who had learned to coax flame from stone in places she had never seen. She lifted the bundle higher, letting its light play across her face, feeling its warmth chase away the morning's chill. Behind her, she heard whispered words from her people prayers, protective charms, expressions of wonder and fear. Before her, Kalen's people watched with equal intensity, their faces painted by the firelight into masks of hope and anxiety. The moment stretched, balanced on the knife's edge, between acceptance and rejection, trust and suspicion. In that balance, Asher felt the weight of choice that would echo through generations. What she did now would determine whether this first meeting became the foundation for something greater, or the first stone in a wall of misunderstanding that might never be torn down. She made her choice. Turning to face her people, Asher held the flame high enough for all to see. Then, in words that rang clear across the morning air, she spoke the ritual response that had been old when her grandmother's grandmother was young. Fire shared is life shared. Fire given is trust given. Fire accepted is kinship acknowledged. From the gathered supplies at her feet, she took her own bundle of prepared tinder and kindling. With Kalen's flame, she lit her own fire, the foreign spark birthing a blaze that would burn according to her people's ways, but fed by the gift of his offering. Two fires now burned in the space between them, his and hers, foreign and familiar, separate yet born from the same source. The symbolism was perfect, its simplicity. Different peoples, different traditions, but sharing the fundamental spark that made them human. Kalen's face transformed as he watched her light her fire from his. The careful control he had maintained throughout their meeting cracked just slightly, allowing through a smile of such pure joy that Asher felt her own heart lift in response. In his language, musical, with unfamiliar consonants. He spoke words that needed no translation. Gratitude, wonder, the recognition of a gift, received as well as given. Around them, both groups began to relax. Not completely trust would take time to build. Understanding would require patience and effort. But the fundamental barrier had been crossed. Fire had been shared. The most basic human ritual had been completed successfully. The warmth from their twin fires began to chase away the morning's chill, creating a small pocket of comfort in the vast wilderness. And in that warmth, other possibilities began to stir. The possibility of shared meals, of common shelter, of knowledge exchanged and stories told across the gaps of language and custom. Nala stepped forward from among Asha's people, her young eyes bright with curiosity rather than fear. In her hands she carried a small carved figurine, a running deer, crafted from mammoth ivory with the exquisite skill that was her people's gift. Without words, she approached the space between the fires and placed the carving on the snow, then stepped back. From Kalen's group, a young man emerged barely more than a boy, with the same lean grace that marked all his people. In his hands he held a necklace of polished stones, each one shaped like a perfect teardrop, strung on sinew that had been dyed with colors Asha had never seen. He placed it beside Nala's carving, the two gifts lying together in the snow like promises waiting to be kept. And so it began, the exchange, the reaching across difference toward understanding. The slow, careful process of building bridges out, of generosity and curiosity and hope. As the sun climbed higher and the fires burned steadier, more gifts appeared in the space between them. Carved tools and woven patterns, shaped stones and polished bones, each one a word in a conversation that transcended language. Each one a small act of faith in the possibility that different could still mean compatible. Kalen and Asha remained beside their fires, no longer watching each other with the wariness of potential enemies, but with the careful attention of those learning to read a new kind of text. In his face, she saw intelligence tempered by caution, strength balanced by gentleness, the kind of depth that suggested thoughts extending far beyond the immediate moment. In her face, he saw wisdom earned through hard experience, compassion that included but transcended simple kindness, the bedrock solidity that came from knowing exactly who you were and where you belonged in the great pattern of existence. The morning was becoming something neither of them had expected. Not just a meeting, but a recognition. Not just contact between strangers, but the first hesitant steps in a dance that might lead toward unity. Neither of them could have guessed how quickly everything would change, how fragile the bridge they were building really was, how easily fear could shatter what hope had begun to create. But for now, in the warmth of shared flame and the growing pile of mutual gifts, it was possible to believe that this was how the world was meant to be. Different peoples meeting in peace, sharing what they had, learning what they could, building together something larger than either could achieve alone. The fires burned steady and bright, painting the speaking stones with light that seemed to approve of what was unfolding in their shadow. And in that light, two branches of humanity began, however tentatively, to remember what it meant to be one people beneath the vast sky that sheltered them all. The sound came from Asha's throat without conscious thought, a musical approximation of the word Kalen had spoken when offering fire. Her tongue, unused to the liquid syllables of his language, shaped the unfamiliar sound as best it could. Tash. The effect was immediate and electric. Kalen's entire body stiffened as if struck, his dark eyes widening with surprise that quickly transformed into something deeper: wonder, recognition. The dawning realization that the barrier between their peoples might not be as insurmountable as he had feared. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, and Asha felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the warmth of their twin fires. Had she made some terrible error? Broken some taboo of his people by attempting to speak their sacred word with unpracticed lips? Then Kalen threw back his head and laughed. It was not the harsh bark of mockery or the nervous giggle of embarrassment. It was pure delight, the sound of someone discovering an unexpected treasure, of a door opening when you had expected to find only wall. The laughter bubbled up from deep in his chest, rich and warm as honey, and it transformed his entire face, from watchful stranger to someone she might have known all her life. Atash, he repeated, his pronunciation crisp and sure. Then, pointing to her fire, to his fire, to the space of warmth they had created between them, Atash, Atash, Atash. Understanding flowered in Asha's mind like flames catching tinder. He was teaching her, showing her how the word should sound, how it could be used, how this single bridge of language might support the weight of greater understanding. She tried again, listening more carefully to the music of his speech, letting her tongue learn the dance of unfamiliar sounds. Atash. Yes. The word burst from him in her language. Somehow he had been listening, learning, picking up the patterns of her speech, even as she struggled with his. Yes. Atash. The moment of shared laughter, of mutual recognition and delight, rippled outward, like stones thrown into still water. Both groups of watchers felt it, saw it, understood, without words, that something significant had just occurred. Not just an exchange of sounds, but a cracking open of the shell that had kept their peoples apart. Young Nala took a step forward, her face bright, with the fearless curiosity of youth. Pointing to herself, she spoke clearly. Nala. Kalen's attention shifted to her, and his expression softened with the universal gentleness that adults showed to children who were not their own, but who carried the precious spark of innocence. He repeated her name carefully, his accent making it sound like music. Na. La. Then, pointing to himself with the same simple gesture, Kalen. Kalen, Nala repeated, and clapped her hands together with delight when he nodded and smiled his approval. It was such a small thing, the exchange of names, the first tentative reaching across the gulf of language. But around it, Asha could feel the morning reshaping itself. What had begun as a formal meeting between groups who might be enemies was becoming something else entirely. The first halting conversation between peoples who might, just might, find ways to understand each other. More words followed. Kalen pointed to the snow. Shaftan. Asha repeated it, then offered her own. Korvash. He struggled with the harder consonants of her language, his face creasing with concentration, as he tried to wrap his tongue around sounds it had never been asked to make. Sky, Asman, and Vethera, stone, sang, and thek, tree, darakt, and more. Each exchange brought small explosions of delight from both groups. Children from both sides began to edge forward, their natural curiosity overcoming the cautions that had been drilled into them. Adults found themselves leaning closer, straining to catch each new word, to understand the rhythms and patterns of this alien speech. But it was when Asha, growing bold, with success, pointed to Kalen himself and tried to offer the word her people used for friend, Ashton, that the first crack appeared in their fragile construction. The sound died in her throat as she saw his face change. The openness, the delight, the growing warmth, all of it vanished, replaced by something harder, more guarded. Behind him, she could see similar shifts in his companions' faces, as if her word had triggered some response she couldn't understand. Ashton? She tried again, uncertain what had gone wrong. Kalen shook his head sharply, his hand moving in a gesture that clearly meant no. He spoke rapidly in his own language, words that carried undertones of warning, of denial, of something that might have been pain. The moment of connection shattered, like ice breaking under too much weight. Asha felt her own people's tension spike behind her. Jorik's hand had returned to his knife hilt, and she could hear the soft whisper of others checking their weapons. Whatever she had said, however innocently, it had triggered a response that threatened to undo everything they had built. What? She began, but Kalen cut her off with a sharp gesture, his eyes now holding wariness where moments before there had been warmth. From among his people, an older woman stepped forward, their equivalent of Old Makan, perhaps their keeper of traditions and reader of signs. She spoke to Kalen in their liquid tongue, her voice carrying the authority of age and wisdom, but her eyes, when they fixed on Asha, held suspicion that bordered on hostility. The language lesson that had begun with such promise was crumbling before Asha's eyes, and she didn't understand why. What had seemed like such a simple gesture, offering a word for friendship, had somehow become a source of conflict. Kalen listened to his elder's words, his face growing more closed with each syllable. When she finished speaking, he looked back at Asha with an expression that held regret alongside renewed caution. "No, Ashton," he said carefully, using her word but rejecting its meaning. "No, no good." The rejection hit Asha like a physical blow. She had offered friendship and been refused, had reached across the gap between their peoples and been pushed back. The warmth that had been building between them dissipated like smoke on the wind. Around the twin fires, both groups watched the collapse of understanding with expressions that mixed disappointment with a resignation that seemed to say, "We should have known this would happen. We should have known it was too good to last." But even as the moment dissolved into awkwardness and renewed suspicion, neither Asha nor Kalen could quite let go of what they had glimpsed in those few minutes of shared laughter and mutual learning. In his eyes, she could still see traces of the person who had delighted in her attempts at his language. In her face, he could still recognize the woman who had received his gift of fire with such grace. The problem wasn't that they were enemies. The problem was deeper, more complex. They were people trying to communicate across gaps that went beyond language, beyond custom, into territories of meaning and assumption that neither of them had mapped. Young Torak, the boy from Kalen's group who had offered the necklace of teardrops, stepped into the silence with the obliviousness of youth. Pointing to the pile of gifts that lay between the fires, he spoke a single word in their language. Chobat. Good. His gestures seemed to suggest. The gifts were good. The sharing was good. Whatever had gone wrong with words, the fundamental exchange remained positive. Asha seized on the moment, grateful for any bridge back toward understanding. Chobat, she repeated, then offered her own word. Thrala. This time, Kalen's face didn't close down. Instead, he nodded slowly, accepting the exchange, while maintaining the careful distance that her earlier word had created. Progress. But progress made, cautious by the reminder that understanding could shatter as easily as it could form. The morning continued, but it was different now, more careful, more aware of the pitfalls that lay hidden beneath the surface of even the simplest communication. They continued to exchange words, but with greater caution, testing each offering before fully accepting it. And in that caution, in that awareness of how fragile their connection really was, lay the seeds of what would come later. The recognition that despite their similarities, despite their shared humanity, there were depths of difference that might prove impossible to bridge. But for now, they continued trying, continued reaching across the gaps, continued believing, against growing evidence to the contrary, that understanding was possible if only they tried hard enough. The fires burned on, casting warmth and light into the space between them. But the warmth felt less certain now, the light less steady. And in the distance, clouds were beginning to gather on the horizon, carrying with them the promise of weather that would test everything they were trying to build. The first snowflakes fell like whispered warnings. So light they seemed more dream than weather. But Asha knew the signs, the particular stillness in the air, the way the wind held its breath before the real storm arrived, the smell of snow that would not stop falling until it had remade the world in its own image. "Shelter," she said to Kalen, the word one of the few they had successfully shared during their morning of careful exchange. She pointed toward the line of cliffs that rose behind the speaking stones, where ancient rockfalls had carved out caves and overhangs that could provide protection from the weather. Kalen's eyes followed her gesture, reading the approaching storm with the same skill that had kept his people alive through countless journeys across hostile terrain. He spoke rapidly to his companions in their liquid tongue, words that carried the urgency of immediate decision. Survival trumped diplomacy when the sky began to bare its teeth. Within moments, both groups were moving with the efficient haste of people who understood that winter storms in these mountains could kill the prepared as easily as the foolish. The morning's tentative peace held as they worked together, if not in harmony, then at least in the shared recognition that the weather was a common enemy that cared nothing for their cultural differences. The cave Asha led them to was one she had known since childhood, a natural cathedral carved from living rock by some ancient river that had long since found other channels. The entrance was broad enough to accommodate both groups, the interior spacious enough that they could maintain respectful distances, while sharing the essential shelter. But as they filed into the echoing space, as they began the process of setting up for what might be a long wait, the fragile understanding they had built around the fires outside began to strain under new pressures. Space. The cave was large, but not infinite. As both groups claimed areas and began unpacking their traveling gear, territorial instincts that had been dormant in the open air began to awaken. Asha's people naturally gravitated toward the deeper sections, the places that felt most defensible. Kalen's people, with their nomadic instincts, spread toward the areas with the best airflow and the clearest escape routes. The result was an unintentional but unmistakable division. Asha's people clustered near the back wall, their broad bodies and earth-toned clothing, making them seem like extensions of the cave itself. Kalen's people arranged themselves nearer the entrance, their lighter builds and brighter ornaments catching what little light filtered in from outside. Between them lay a space that neither group quite dared to cross, a no-man's land that grew more significant with each passing hour. Fire was the next problem. Both groups needed warmth, needed light, needed the comfort that only flame could provide in the darkness of a cave during a storm. But there was only so much dry fuel to be found, and the smoke from multiple fires would quickly turn their shelter into a choking trap. Old Makan approached Asha as she wrestled with this dilemma, his ancient face grave with concern. "One fire," he said quietly. "There must be only one fire, shared between us. But whose fire? Built how? Fed by whom?" The questions carried weight beyond their practical implications. Fire was identity. Fire was power. Fire was the sacred center around which all human community organized itself. To share a fire was to acknowledge kinship. But to control a fire was to assert dominance. Asha watched Kalen across the divide, saw him engaged in what appeared to be a similar discussion with his own elder, the sharp-eyed woman who had spoken against her earlier offer of friendship. The woman's gestures were emphatic, her voice low but carrying clear undertones of warning. The storm outside was strengthening. Through the cave mouth, they could see the snow falling more heavily now, driven by winds that howled through the rock formations like the voices of angry spirits. Whatever decision they made about fire would have to be made soon before the cold penetrated deep enough to make the choice irrelevant. It was young Nala who solved the immediate problem, stepping into the neutral space between the groups with her arms full of carefully hoarded kindling. Without asking permission from either side, she began building a fire in the exact center of the cave, equidistant from both camps. "For everyone," she said simply, using the word they had learned that meant good, Thrala, and pointing to include both groups in her gesture. Neither adult wanted to be the one to stop a child from trying to provide warmth for everyone, but neither wanted to be the first to approach the neutral fire either. The result was an uncomfortable standoff, both groups watching as the girl worked with stubborn determination to create something that would serve all their needs. Finally, Kalen rose from his place and walked slowly toward the growing fire, his movements careful and non-threatening. He carried his own contribution of fuel, dried grass, and strips of bark that would help the flames catch and hold. Without words, he added his materials to Nala's construction, then stepped back to a respectful distance. Asha felt a stir of something that might have been hope. Perhaps this could work. Perhaps the practical necessities of survival would override the growing tensions, force them back toward cooperation. She was approaching the fire with her own offering of fuel when the first fight broke out. It started with food, or rather, with the lack of it. The storm was clearly going to last through the night, possibly longer. Both groups had brought provisions for their planned meeting, but neither had prepared for an extended stay in one place. As the afternoon wore on and the snow continued to pile against the cave mouth, the reality of their situation began to sink in. There might not be enough food. The realization crept through both camps like a cold fog, unspoken, but unmistakable. Asha saw it in the way her people began taking more careful inventory of their supplies. In the worried glances mothers cast toward their children. She saw it reflected in Kalen's group as well, the same calculations, the same growing concern. And with the recognition of potential scarcity came something darker. The evolution of thought that turned us and them from neutral categories into competing teams. We have enough food for our people. We might have enough food for our people. We don't have enough food for our people and theirs. They are threatening our survival. They are the enemy. It was Jorik who voiced what others were thinking, his words pitched low but still carrying across the cave's acoustic spaces. We should not have brought them here. Our children will go hungry so that strangers can eat. From Kalen's side came a response in their liquid tongue, equally quiet but unmistakably confrontational. The elder woman's voice carried notes of accusation, of blame for the situation they found themselves in. The fire that Nala had built to unite them became a dividing line. Each group remained on its own side, watching the other with growing suspicion. The warmth and light that should have provided comfort became a harsh illumination of their differences, their competing needs, their fundamental separateness. Asha tried to stem the tide of mistrust before it could build to dangerous levels. She gathered her people around her, speaking in whispers that nonetheless carried clearly in the cave's confines. We are guests in this situation as much as they are. The storm chose the timing, not us. We share what we have. We endure what we must. We remember that they too have children who need food and warmth. But her words, however well intended, only highlighted the growing divide. Across the fire, she could see Kalen engaged in his own urgent discussions with his people, his gestures becoming more animated as the debate intensified. What was he telling them? That her people were potential threats? That their own survival had to take priority? That the tentative trust of the morning had been a mistake? The snowfall outside intensified to a roar, the sound filling the cave like the breathing of some enormous beast. They were trapped now, truly and completely. No possibility of leaving until the storm passed. No escape from whatever tensions might build in the enforced intimacy of shared shelter. As the day wore toward evening, as the single fire burned lower and the darkness beyond its reach grew thicker, the divisions that had seemed manageable in the morning began to feel insurmountable. They were no longer two groups of people trying to understand each other. They had become competitors for limited resources, suspicious strangers forced into dangerous proximity by circumstances beyond their control. And in the growing darkness, in the whispered conversations that grew more heated with each passing hour, neither side could quite remember why they had thought this meeting was a good idea in the first place. The fire burned on, but it no longer seemed to unite them. Instead, it became a spotlight illuminating just how far apart they really were, how fragile the bonds of shared humanity could be when survival itself seemed threatened. Outside, the storm howled with the voice of winter itself, indifferent to the drama unfolding in the cave. Inside, two peoples who had briefly glimpsed the possibility of kinship began the slow, sad slide towards something much darker. The night was young, and it would be long. It began with a child's cry. Asha woke in the deepest part of the night to the sound of little Koru sobbing, not the normal fussing of a toddler, but the desperate wailing of hunger that pierces straight through sleep to the animal core of adult protectiveness. The boy was barely 3 winters old, all round cheeks and trusting eyes, and he had been growing weaker throughout the long day of enforced waiting. Around her, her people stirred with the restless energy of those who had slept poorly in an alien place, surrounded by strangers whose whispered conversations carried undertones of meanings they couldn't interpret. The single fire had burned down to coals during the night, its warmth barely reaching the edges of the cave where both groups huddled in their separate territories. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault. If anything, it had grown stronger during the dark hours, the wind screaming through the rock formations, with a voice that spoke of winter's absolute dominion. No one would be leaving this cave until the weather chose to release them. Little Koru's mother, Vera, held him close to her chest, rocking and whispering the old comfort songs. But the child's cries only grew more desperate, more painful to hear. He was hungry. They were all hungry. The food that had seemed adequate for a day's meeting was proving woefully insufficient for an extended stay. Across the dying fire, Asha could see that Kalen's people were awake as well. their faces painted by the fading red glow into masks of shadow and shifting light. They too had children among them, young ones whose needs could not be reasoned with or postponed. In the darkness, she could hear similar sounds of discomfort, of growing desperation. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. There was not enough food for everyone to eat well, maybe not enough for everyone to eat at all. Jorik rose from his sleeping furs, his face grim with the recognition of approaching crisis. Without words, he began moving through their group, taking inventory of what remained. The results, whispered from person to person, were worse than anyone had hoped. 2 days of storm. By his estimate, maybe 3. Enough food among Asher's people for 1 more day if they rationed carefully. After that, from Kalen's side of the cave, came the murmur of similar calculations. Their elder woman's voice carried clearly in the stone-walled space, speaking in their liquid tongue, but with intonations that needed no translation. Concern, fear, the growing recognition that this was not a problem that could be solved by goodwill and patient waiting. It was then that Torak, the young man from Kalen's group who had offered the necklace of teardrops, made his mistake. Driven by the same protective instincts that motivated Jorik, he approached the neutral space around the fire. But instead of stopping at the invisible boundary that had been respected throughout the long day, he crossed into the territory Asher's people had claimed as their own. In his hands he carried a small bundle food, by its shape and careful wrapping. His intentions were probably innocent. Perhaps he meant to offer what little he could spare to help feed little Koru, whose cries were cutting through everyone's attempts at rest. But in the darkness, in the atmosphere of growing suspicion and fear, his approach looked like something else entirely, like reconnaissance, like theft, like the first move in whatever conflict might be building between the two groups. Jorik's response was instant and violent. He lunged from the shadows, tackling the young man to the stone floor with a force that drove the breath from both their bodies. The bundle Torak had been carrying scattered, its contents dried meat and hard cakes spilling across the cave floor. "Thief!" Jorik snarled, though the word came out in their own language, incomprehensible, to the stranger pinned beneath him. "You come to steal from children." Torak struggled beneath him, shouting words in his own tongue that might have been explanations, denials, calls for help. But in the chaos of bodies and voices, and the flickering firelight, interpretation was impossible. Kalen erupted from his sleeping place like a force of nature, his lean body moving with the deadly grace of a born warrior. Behind him came others from his group, their faces harsh with the realization that their youngest member was under attack. "Stop!" Asher's voice cut through the rising chaos, but she was too late. The moment had its own momentum now, fed by fear and misunderstanding and the terrible pressure of being trapped with potential enemies in an impossible situation. The cave exploded into violence. Not the clean, purposeful combat of warriors meeting in honest battle, but the ugly, desperate struggling of cornered animals fighting for survival. Bodies collided in the darkness, weapons flashed in the dying firelight, and voices rose in cries of pain, anger, and terror. Asher found herself in the center of the chaos, trying desperately to reach the place where Jorik and Torak still struggled. If she could separate them, explain the misunderstanding, perhaps this madness could be stopped before it consumed them all. But as she pushed through the melee, someone she never knew who struck her from behind. Pain exploded through her skull and she fell, her vision fragmenting into sparks of light against encroaching darkness. The last thing she saw before unconsciousness claimed her was Kalen's face, across the cave, his expression a mixture of horror and despair as he watched everything they had built during the morning's brief peace tear itself apart in blood and violence. She woke to silence, the kind of silence that follows catastrophe, when the destruction is complete and there is nothing left to fight over. Her head throbbed with each heartbeat, and when she tried to move, pain shot through her body like lightning. The cave was darker than she remembered. It took her a moment to realize why. The fire had gone out. In the weak grey light that filtered through the cave mouth, she could see the fire, aftermath of the night's violence. Bodies lay scattered across the stone floor, some moving, some still, all bearing the marks of brutal, confused combat. Blood painted the rocks in patterns that would haunt her dreams for whatever years remained to her. "Nala," she called weakly, her voice echoing strangely in the sudden emptiness. No answer. She forced herself to move, to search among the fallen forms for the faces she needed to see. Some of her people were stirring, moaning softly as consciousness returned. Others, Jorik lay near the place where it had all begun, his eyes staring sightlessly at the cave roof. In his hand, he still clutched the bone-hafted knife that had been his grandfather's, its blade now dark, with blood that was not his own. Beside him, young Torak was equally still, the food he had tried to offer, scattered around his body, like a bitter mockery of generous intentions. And there were others, too many others, people who had woken that morning with hope for understanding, for connection, for the possibility that two branches of humanity might find ways to grow together rather than apart. Now, they were just meat cooling on cold stone. Across the cave, in the space where Kaelin's people had made their camp, she could see similar devastation, similar waste, similar proof that fear and misunderstanding could transform potential friends into actual corpses with terrifying speed. "Kaelin," she called, her voice stronger now but carrying notes of desperate hope. A figure stirred near the cave mouth. She saw him rise, saw him turn toward her voice, saw the blood that matted his dark hair and painted one side of his face in crimson streaks. Their eyes met across the charnel house that their shelter had become. In his gaze, she saw the same mixture of grief and horror that she felt in her own heart. The recognition that something irreplaceable had been shattered beyond any hope of repair. He had survived. She had survived. But everything else, the tentative bridge they had built, the possibility of understanding, the hope that two peoples might find common ground, all of that lay as dead as the bodies scattered between them. Kaelin began, then stopped. What words existed for this? What language could encompass the magnitude of what had been lost? Instead of speaking, he turned and walked toward the cave mouth, toward the storm that was finally beginning to weaken as the grey dawn struggled through the cloud cover. Behind him, the survivors of his group began to gather, fewer than had entered the cave. Much fewer. They would leave, she realized. They would walk out into the morning and never look back. And she could not blame them, would not blame them. This place had become a tomb for trust, a monument to the terrible fragility of hope. As Kaelin reached the cave entrance, he paused and looked back one final time. The expression on his face would stay with Asha for the rest of her life. Not hatred, which she could have understood, but something far worse. Sadness. The kind of profound grief that comes from witnessing the death of possibilities, the murder of dreams. He raised one hand, in what might have been farewell, or apology, or simple acknowledgement that they had tried and failed in the most catastrophic way imaginable. Then he was gone, leading his depleted people out into a world that seemed suddenly much larger and lonelier than it had the morning before. Behind him, the cave fell back into silence. The fire that had been meant to unite them was nothing but cold ash. The gifts they had exchanged lay scattered and forgotten among the evidence of violence. The words they had shared, those first tentative bridges across the gulf of difference, seemed as distant as dreams remembered from childhood. Asha knelt beside the dead coals, her hands shaking as she tried to coax life back into them. But the fire, like everything else they had built, was beyond resurrection. For the first time in 50,000 winters, the fire had forgotten how to burn. And in that forgetting, two branches of humanity began the long retreat from each other that would last until the stars themselves grew cold and distant, until the very memory of this meeting became legend, became myth, became the half-remembered dream of a species that had once, briefly, glimpsed the possibility of being whole. The snow fell through the opening of the cave like tears from a grief-struck sky, each flake settling on the cooling bodies with the gentleness of a final blessing. Asha moved through the carnage like a sleepwalker, her bare feet leaving dark prints in the mixture of ash and blood that painted the stone floor in patterns too terrible for meaning. Here lay old Makan, his white beard stained crimson, his ancient hands still curved around the prayer stones he had been clutching when the violence found him. His eyes, clouded with age, but bright with wisdom, just hours before, now stared at nothing with the cold, perfect emptiness of the truly departed. Usha knelt beside him, her fingers trembling as she closed those eyes that had seen so much, that had guided her people through countless decisions, that would never again read the signs written in smoke and star. "Forgive us," she whispered, though whether she spoke to the dead man or to whatever gods might witness such foolishness, she could not say. The cave that had promised shelter had become a charnel house. Bodies lay where they had fallen, her people and Kalen's people tangled together in death as they had never been in life. Young Vera clutched her son Koru against her chest, both of them finally, tragically still. The child's hunger had been answered by a sleep deeper than any meal could satisfy, his small face peaceful now in a way that made Asha's heart crack like ice under too much weight. She counted them as she moved through the devastation. 7 of her people dead, including old Makan and the child. Too many wounded to move easily. Of the 12 who had entered this place with hope in their hearts, only 5 remained unbroken enough to consider any kind of journey home. Of Kalen's people, she could count 4 bodies, their lean forms somehow looking even more fragile in death than they had in life. The young man who had approached with food, Torak. She remembered his name now. Far too late for the knowledge to matter, lay sprawled near the place where their territories had met. His outstretched hand still reached toward the scattered provisions that had cost him his life, the gesture of generosity that had been mistaken for theft, frozen in perpetual accusation. The irony was bitter as winter wind. More food lay scattered on the cave floor now than any of them could have eaten, spilled from torn pouches and trampled under the feet of the dying. The scarcity that had triggered their violence had been largely imaginary fear, magnified by darkness and suspicion, until it became more real than the truth. Outside the cave mouth, the storm was finally exhausting itself. The wind that had howled through the night like the voice of all the world's grief was settling into irregular gusts, and the snow fell now in the straight, purposeful lines that spoke of weather systems finally finding their rest. Soon it would be possible to leave this place, to carry the wounded and the dead back to whatever remained of home. But not yet. Not while the mountain slopes were still treacherous with fresh powder. Not while the survivors were still too shocked by what they had witnessed to make rational decisions about routes and timing. For now, there was nothing to do but wait, and remember, and try to understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. Movement in the grey light beyond the cave mouth caught her attention. A figure standing among the rocks where the path descended toward the valley, tall, lean, unmistakably from Kalen's people. Her heart lurched, with something that might have been hope, or might have been fear. Had one of them remained behind? Had someone come back to? What? To explain? To apologize? To finish what the night had started? She moved carefully to the cave entrance, staying in shadow, but able to see the figure more clearly. It was Kalen himself, she realized, standing motionless as carved stone among the snow-dusted boulders. He was alone, no warriors flanking him, no weapons visible in his hands, just a man standing vigil in the cold morning air, watching the place where his world had shattered alongside hers. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that moment of recognition, Asha felt the weight of everything they had lost settle on her shoulders, like a cloak, woven from regret. He had been beautiful in the brief time when they had tried to understand each other, not just physically, though his lean grace and intelligent eyes had appealed to something deep in her nature, but beautiful in the way he had reached toward her people with openness and hope. Now he looked like a man carved from grief, his face bearing the marks of violence, but also something deeper, the knowledge that he had been part of something irreplaceable and had watched it die, that he would carry the memory of this failure for whatever years remained to him, would wonder always if different words, different choices, different timing might have changed everything. She raised one hand in acknowledgement, not greeting, for there could be no return to the warmth of their first meeting, but simple recognition of shared sorrow. He returned the gesture with movements that spoke of exhaustion that went beyond the merely physical, soul-deep weariness, the fatigue of someone who had glimpsed paradise and watched it burn. For a long moment they stood like that, two representatives of their species looking at each other across a gulf that could no longer be bridged. All around them, the mountain wilderness stretched away in pristine silence, indifferent to the small, human tragedy that had unfolded in its midst. Snow continued to fall on the speaking stones where they had first met, covering the carved spirals with blank white that erased the ancient symbols, as surely as the violence had erased their hopes. Then, Kalen turned and walked away, his figure growing smaller and more indistinct with each step until he vanished entirely among the rocks and drifting snow. Behind him, his footprints filled quickly, leaving no trace of his passing, except in Asha's memory. She would never see him again, would never know what became of him, or his people. Whether they found safety in the southern lands, whether they told stories of this meeting around their fires, whether they mourned the lost possibilities as deeply as she did. He vanished from her life as completely as if he had been only a dream, leaving behind nothing but the taste of what might have been. Inside the cave, she heard sounds of stirring survivors beginning to wake, to assess their wounds, to face the terrible arithmetic of who remained and who was gone forever. Soon she would need to become their leader again, to make the decisions that would carry them through the next hours and days. Soon she would need to be strong for those who depended on her. But for now, she stood in the cave mouth and watched the snow fall on a world that seemed suddenly much larger and lonelier than it had been the morning before. The white crystals settled on her hair, her shoulders, her outstretched hands, covering her gradually in the same blank forgiveness that was erasing all trace of the meeting that had promised so much and delivered so little. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled long and mournful, as if the very wilderness were mourning the loss of whatever this encounter might have become. The sound echoed off the mountain faces, multiplied and transformed until it seemed like the voice of the earth itself, expressing a sorrow too vast for any single throat to contain. Asha closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her, carrying with it all the grief she could not yet fully feel, all the regret that would grow with time into something that would shape the rest of her life. When the howling finally faded, she opened her eyes to a world that looked exactly the same as it had before but felt fundamentally changed. The snow continued to fall, patient and inexorable, burying the past under layers of white silence. And in that silence, the long forgetting began. Time moved differently after the cave. It flowed like honey in winter, thick and golden and reluctant, as if the world itself had grown weary of its own turning. Days blended into nights, blended into days, marked only by the rising and setting of a sun that seemed more distant than before, its light reaching them through veils of cloud and memory that softened all edges, muted all colors. Asha led her depleted people home by paths that felt unfamiliar, despite having been walked by her ancestors for generations beyond counting. The wounded leaned heavily on those who could still walk straight, their progress measured not in distance covered, but in simple endurance, the ability to place one foot before the other when every step carried them further from what they had lost and closer to what they could never truly return to. Behind them, the speaking stones stood sentinel over emptiness. Snow filled the depressions where their fires had burned, erasing the last physical evidence of the meeting that had promised so much and delivered only grief. The gifts they had exchanged lay buried beneath layers of white, the carved bone and polished stones becoming part of the earth, archaeological mysteries for some future generation that would never understand their significance. But it was not just the physical traces that faded. Something else was disappearing, something harder to name, but impossible to ignore. The stories themselves seemed to be growing lighter, less substantial, as if reality were deciding that some truths were too painful to preserve. When they finally reached the Valley of Warm Springs, when the familiar sight of their shelters came into view like islands of meaning in an ocean of snow, those who had remained behind gathered around them with questions that had no satisfactory answers. Where were the others? What had happened to old Makan, to little Koru, to the warriors who had gone out that morning with such purpose in their steps? How could they explain that the future had arrived and been found wanting? That the greatest opportunity in their people's history had transformed into their greatest catastrophe? That contact with others like themselves had proved not enlightening but devastating? The words seemed to lose weight, even as Asha spoke them. Practical details, who had died, how they had died, where they were buried. These could be communicated clearly enough. But the deeper truth, the significance of what had been attempted and lost, slipped away like smoke on wind whenever she tried to grasp it fully. It was as if the world were protecting itself from the knowledge of this failure, as if reality itself were deciding that some possibilities were too dangerous to contemplate, too painful to remember clearly. Better to let them fade into the realm of half-remembered dreams, of stories that might or might not have been true. The process was subtle, but inexorable. Each time the story was told, it became a little less specific, a little more symbolic. The strangers became less like real people, and more like forces of nature, windwalkers, firebringers, spirits of the southern lands, who had appeared for purposes beyond human understanding. Kaelin's face, so vivid in Asher's memory during those first days after the cave, began to blur around the edges, not disappearing entirely, but becoming more archetypal, less individual. The precise sound of his laughter, when she had first attempted his word for fire, faded into a general impression of joy briefly shared and permanently lost. Even the language they had begun to learn together, those first tentative bridges across the gap of understanding, seemed to lose its grip on memory. The words themselves remained, but their significance grew unclear. Had Atash really meant fire? Had the sound she remembered as his name really been Kaelin? Or was that simply what her mind had made of unfamiliar syllables? Winter deepened, and with it the sense that time itself was becoming heavier, more viscous. The survivors of the cave moved through their daily routines with the careful deliberation of people recovering from fever dreams, never quite sure what was real memory and what was the product of trauma-addled minds trying to make sense of senseless events. Nala, who had built the fire that was meant to unite them all, rarely spoke of those days. When pressed for details by younger children hungry for stories, she would stare into whatever fire currently burned before them and speak in fragments. There were others. They knew songs we didn't know. They gave us gifts. Something went wrong. The vagueness was not evasion but genuine uncertainty. The events in the cave had taken on the quality of dreams, half remembered upon waking, vivid in feeling but frustratingly unclear in detail. Had the violence really been as sudden and terrible as it seemed? Had there really been so much blood, so many bodies? Or had fear and darkness magnified normal human disagreement into something that seemed apocalyptic? As winter turned toward spring, as the survivors gradually healed from their physical wounds and began to adapt to their new reality, a strange thing happened. The world itself seemed to be forgetting the strangers. Their tracks, which should have remained visible in sheltered places, faded more quickly than weather alone could account for. The smoke signals that had marked their distant camps were no longer visible, even on the clearest days when visibility stretched to the horizons. The very air seemed emptied of their presence, as if they had been not just visitors, but visitors from a dream that was now ending. Other clans, when messengers finally reached them with news of the meeting and its aftermath, received the information with expressions that mixed sorrow for the dead with a kind of confused relief. The existence of other peoples had always been theoretical to them, something spoken of in the oldest stories, but never quite believed. Their disappearance back into legend felt almost natural, as if the world were returning to its proper order. And perhaps it was. Perhaps there were times when the universe itself recognized that certain meetings were premature, certain possibilities too dangerous to pursue. Perhaps reality had its own wisdom about what knowledge could be safely held and what needed to be forgotten for the sake of all who came after. Asha felt this forgetting, like a physical thing, a gradual lightening of burdens she had not realized she was carrying. The grief remained for old Makan, for little Koru, for all who had died in that terrible night. But the larger sorrow, the sense of cosmic opportunity lost, began to fade into something more manageable. They were who they had always been, the people of the deep places, the children of stone and starlight, the keepers of fires that had burned since the world's youth. They did not need to be anything more. They did not need to reach across impossible gaps toward understanding with those who were too different, too dangerous, too likely to bring change that none of them were ready to embrace. The springs bubbled their eternal comfort. The aurora danced its familiar patterns across the northern sky. The seasons turned with their ancient reliability, carrying away the strangeness of that terrible winter and replacing it with the blessed predictability of survival, continuance, and the slow accumulation of days that led nowhere, but deeper into the familiar mystery of being human in a world that was vast enough to contain them without requiring them to contain it. Time flowed on, thick and golden and forgiving, washing away the sharp edges of memory until what remained was something that could be lived with, something that could be passed down to children as a cautionary tale rather than a tragedy. The strangers faded into legend. The legend faded into myth. The myth faded into the kind of story told around winter fires when the wind howled and the darkness pressed close stories of what might have been, in a world where different choices led to different endings. And in that fading, in that gentle erasure of possibilities too dangerous to pursue, the earth itself seemed to exhale with relief, settling back into patterns of existence that had sustained it through countless ages before humans had dreamed of reaching across the spaces between them. The vanishing was complete. The long forgetting had begun. On the night when the aurora painted the sky in shades of memory and loss, Asha dreamed the dream that would be her final gift to the world. She was old now, ancient by the standards of her people, her strong bones wrapped in flesh that had grown thin and translucent with the passing of countless seasons. Her hair, once dark as winter water, had become white as the snow that crowned the distant peaks, and her eyes held depths that spoke of visions seen and wisdom earned through decades of leading her diminished clan. But in the dream, she was young again, young and standing in a place that was both the valley of warm springs and somewhere else entirely, a realm where time folded upon itself like layers of sediment, where past and future existed simultaneously in the eternal moment of the dreaming mind. Before her stretched a landscape she had never seen but somehow recognized. Vast grasslands dotted with strange animals, forests of trees whose species had no names in her language, rivers that flowed towards seas she could only imagine. But it was not the geography that captured her attention. It was the lights. Lights everywhere. Not the warm, flickering glow of fires tended by human hands, but something else entirely. Cold lights that burned without fuel, bright as stars but fixed to the earth. They traced patterns across the land, like constellations fallen from the sky, straight lines and perfect curves that spoke of purposes and knowledge beyond her comprehension. And moving among these impossible lights were the children of that first meeting, the offspring of possibilities that had died in a cave filled with blood and misunderstanding. They were tall and lean like Kaelin's people, but they carried the solidity of her own folk as well. They moved with the grace of those born to movement, but built with the endurance of those who knew how to endure. They were beautiful, these dream children. Their faces combined the best features of both peoples, the deep wisdom of stone and the bright curiosity of wind. They spoke in voices that carried the liquid music of Kaelin's tongue, but with the earthy resonance of her own people's speech. They built structures that reached toward the sky, but rooted themselves firmly in the earth. In the dream, she walked among them as they went about their incomprehensible lives. She saw them shape metal into forms of impossible delicacy, coax light from substances that had never burned, speak across vast distances without raising their voices. They moved through landscapes that had been carved and shaped according to their will, where water flowed uphill when commanded, and the very air carried their thoughts from place to place. But most wonderful of all, they remembered, in great houses built from materials that seemed to glow with their own inner light, they kept the stories of their beginning. Not just the practical details of survival and expansion, but the deeper truths, the knowledge that they were the product of two streams flowing together, the inheritors of both the patience of stone and the hunger of horizon. They spoke of Asha's people with reverence that brought tears to her dream eyes. The deep dwellers, they called them, the first teachers, the ones who had learned to make fire from nothing and to find warmth in the heart of winter. Their children learned the old songs, practiced the ancient crafts, understood that their own soaring towers and impossible machines rested on foundations laid by those who had been content to live simply and well in the places the earth provided. And they spoke of Kaelin's people too, with equal honor. The far walkers, the horizon seekers, the ones who had carried the gift of curiosity beyond the edges of the known world. From them had come the restlessness that drove exploration, the dissatisfaction with simple answers that led to complex questions, the willingness to risk everything for the possibility of finding something better. The marriage of these two ways of being root and wing, depth and reach, satisfaction and hunger, had created something neither could have achieved alone. A people capable of both profound stability and radical change, both deep wisdom and soaring imagination. In the dream, Asha saw their great gathering places, where thousands came together to share knowledge and celebration. She saw their smallest children learning to work with substances that could heal any injury, solve any problem, bridge any distance. She saw their artists creating beauty that made the aurora itself seem pale. Their teachers unlocking mysteries that made her own people's wisdom look like the first tentative scratches of learning. But she also saw them pause in their magnificent striving to honor the source of all they had become. In quiet moments, in places set aside for remembrance, they would kindle fires in the ancient way with flint and patience and the breath of human lungs. They would speak the old words, sing the old songs. Remember that all their towering achievements began with the simple human discovery that striking stone against stone could bring light into darkness. The dream deepened, and she found herself in a vast chamber whose walls held images beyond counting. Here were preserved the faces of everyone who had contributed to the long story of becoming not just the famous and powerful, but every mother and father, every child who had grown to carry the line forward, every ordinary person whose choices had shaped the great flowing river of descent. And there, in a place of highest honor, were two faces she recognized with a start that went through her like lightning through her bones. Her own face, but younger, unmarked by the grief that would reshape her features after the cave. And beside it, Kaelin's face, wearing the expression of hope and curiosity she had seen in that first moment when their eyes met across the speaking stones. Below their images, words were written in scripts she could not read but somehow understood. Words that spoke of the meeting that never was, the possibility that had been lost, the tragedy that had delayed by millennia, what might have been achieved in a single generation. But also words of gratitude, acknowledgement that even their failure had contributed something essential to the long story. For it was their separation, their tragic inability to bridge the gap between different ways of being human, that had driven both peoples to spread across the earth. Asha's folk had moved deeper into the hidden places, carrying their knowledge of how to live in harmony with the world as they found it. Kaelin's people had wandered further and wider, carrying their gift for adaptation and change into every environment the planet offered. Eventually, across vast stretches of time, their descendants had met again and again, learning slowly how to see past difference to the humanity that connected them all. The dream children she watched were the product of countless such meetings, countless choices to build bridges rather than walls, countless small acts of courage that had slowly healed the wound opened in that ancient cave. As the dream began to fade, as the impossible lights grew dim and the voices of the future grew distant, Asha felt a peace settle over her that was deeper than sleep, more complete than any rest she had known since that terrible night. Her people would not vanish without trace. Kaelin's people would not disappear into the wilderness forever. They would all, in time, become part of something larger and more wonderful than either could have imagined. The failure at the speaking stones had not been final, but merely premature. The bridge that had collapsed under the weight of fear and misunderstanding would be built again, stronger and more beautiful, when both sides were ready for the work it required. She woke to dawn, light filtering through the smoke hole of her shelter, her old body stiff with cold, but her heart warm with visions that would comfort her through whatever days remained. Outside, she could hear the sounds of her people beginning another day, the quiet efficiency of lives lived according to patterns older than individual memory, the eternal human rhythm of survival and renewal. But now those sounds carried new meaning. Each voice she heard, each footstep, each mundane task being performed with practiced skill, all of it was part of the great story. All of it contributed to the slow accumulation of moments that would eventually lead to reunion, redemption, and the fulfillment of possibilities that seemed lost forever. but were merely waiting for their proper time. She smiled as she lay in the growing warmth of morning, understanding finally why she had been given this dream on this particular night. It was not just for her own comfort, but for the story itself. Somewhere in the great pattern of all that was and would be, this dream too would find its way to those who needed to hear it. The children of the far future would know that their beginning was blessed, not cursed. That even the greatest failures could become the foundation for the greatest successes. That love delayed was not love denied, but love made stronger by the journey required to claim it. The aurora might fade. The seasons might turn. The years might carry away everything she had known, and everyone she had loved. But the dream would remain, whispered from one generation to the next until the night when reality finally caught up with vision and made it whole. She closed her eyes and let the warmth of that certainty carry her deeper into the peaceful morning, surrounded by the simple sounds of human life, continuing its ancient dance with hope and time, and the endless possibility of becoming more than it had ever dared to dream. 50,000 years later, on a morning when satellite data painted weather patterns across continents and global positioning systems guided archaeological expeditions to coordinates precise within centimeters, Dr. Sarah Chen knelt in the dirt of a Spanish cave and brushed sediment away from bones that had waited longer than human civilization to tell their story. The limestone cavern was nothing like the cathedral of stone where Asher and Kalen's peoples had sheltered from their final storm. Time and geological processes had reshaped it, narrowed it, filled it with deposits that spoke of ice ages, come and gone, of climate shifts that had rewritten the very geography of continents. But the bones remained, patient as only the dead can be patient, holding their secrets in calcium and collagen that had somehow survived the grinding wheel of deep time. Mixed assemblage, she murmured into her digital recorder, her voice clinical and precise in the way that science demanded. Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis remains in close proximity. Dating suggests contemporaneous deposition, approximately 48 to 52,000 years before present. Around her, the excavation proceeded with the methodical care that archaeology had perfected over centuries of learning to read stories, written in dirt and stone. Graduate students wielded brushes finer than artists' tools, photographing each bone in situ before removal, measuring angles and associations with instruments that could detect relationships invisible to naked eyes. They had been working this site for 3 months now, ever since ground-penetrating radar had revealed the dense cluster of remains beneath what had once been the cave floor. It was a significant find by any measure, one of the largest collections of both species found in a single location, with preservation good enough to extract DNA, to read chemical signatures that spoke of diet and lifestyle, to reconstruct faces from skull fragments, and understand something of how these ancient people had lived. But it was the mystery of their association that had brought Dr. Chen's team here, from universities across 3 continents. Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, in the same space at the same time, their bones intermingled in ways that suggested not coincidence, but encounter. Direct contact between the two groups that had fascinated anthropologists since the first Neanderthal remains were identified in a German valley more than a century before. Evidence of trauma, reported Dr. James Morrison, the forensic specialist who had been analyzing the skeletal remains. His voice carried the careful neutrality that scientists used when presenting findings that might be emotionally difficult. Multiple individuals from both populations show signs of violence. Blade injuries, blunt force trauma, defensive wounds on forearms and hands. Sarah nodded, unsurprised, but saddened nonetheless. Violence was unfortunately common in the archaeological record, evidence of humanity's long struggle with its own aggressive instincts. But the scale of it here, the indication that members of both species had died violently in the same event, suggested something larger than simple warfare. Any indication of cannibalism? She asked, dreading the answer, but needing to know. None that I can detect. Whatever happened here, it wasn't about food acquisition. The bones show no cut marks consistent with processing for consumption. No evidence of deliberate defleshing. Small mercy, Sarah thought. At least their ancient cousins hadn't fallen to the depths of desperation that would have made such measures necessary. She moved to where Dr. Elena Vasquez was carefully exposing what appeared to be a child's remains, tiny bones that spoke of a life cut short before it had barely begun. The positioning was unusual, the small skeleton partially covered by the larger bones of an adult in what might have been a protective embrace. Juvenile Neanderthal, Elena reported softly, maybe 3 or 4 years old, died at the same time as the adult, but no evidence of direct violence on either set of remains. Exposure? Disease? Possibly. Or they could have been non-combatants who died of secondary effects. Stress, starvation, exposure to elements. The clinical language couldn't quite mask the tragedy of what they were uncovering. Families destroyed, communities shattered, 2 entire ways of being human, brought into violent contact with consequences that echoed across millennia. These weren't just bones and archaeological specimens. They were the remains of people who had loved and hoped and dreamed, who had faced their final moments with whatever courage and desperation such circumstances demanded. As the day wore on and more remains emerged from their patient earth, a picture began to form of what this site represented. Not a settlement or hunting camp, but a place where 2 groups had sheltered together, possibly during severe weather. The tool assemblages scattered throughout the cave included both Mousterian implements, typical of Neanderthal manufacture, and the more sophisticated technologies associated with early modern humans. They were sharing space, observed Dr. Morrison, as he catalogued a series of stone blades that showed both technological traditions. Whatever brought them together, it wasn't immediately hostile. The artifact distributions suggest coexistence, at least initially. Sarah found herself wondering about the details that bones and stones could never reveal. What had these ancient people thought when they first encountered each other? Had they recognized kinship across the differences in body structure and cultural practice? Had there been moments of understanding, attempts at communication, gestures of friendship that had somehow gone tragically wrong? The questions were unanswerable, of course. Science could tell them about diet and disease, about technology and climate, about the broad patterns of human dispersal across continents. But it couldn't resurrect the personal moments, the individual choices, the specific emotions that had shaped these ancient lives. We'll call them Neanderthals, she said to herself, not realizing she had spoken aloud until Dr. Vasquez looked up from her careful excavation. Sorry? Just thinking about names, how we label the past to make sense of it. Neanderthal is just the name of a German valley where the first remains were found. It doesn't tell us anything about what they called themselves, how they understood their place in the world, what stories they told their children. Elena nodded thoughtfully. And we're modern humans, or anatomically modern Homo sapiens, equally arbitrary from their perspective. They probably had names for themselves that meant something like the real people, or the chosen ones, the way every human culture does. The conversation was interrupted by excitement from across the excavation area, where one of the graduate students had uncovered something unusual. Not bone this time, but worked stone of exceptional quality. A carved figurine, no larger than a human palm, depicting what might have been a running animal. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, showing artistic skill and aesthetic sensibility that challenged assumptions about Neanderthal capabilities. As Sarah examined the carving under powerful field lighting, she felt a strange sense of connection across the vast gulf of time. Someone had made this object with care and skill, had invested time and effort in creating beauty that served no practical purpose. Someone had been proud enough of their work to carry it with them, to keep it safe, to value it enough that it had remained with them until the very end. Mammoth ivory, she determined after careful examination. The carving technique is consistent with Neanderthal tool traditions, but the level of artistic sophistication is remarkable. What she couldn't know, what no amount of scientific analysis could reveal, was that this figurine had been carved by a young woman named Nala, offered as a gift in the space between 2 fires, on a morning when the world had briefly held its breath, with the possibility of understanding. That it had been part of an exchange that had begun with hope and ended with tragedy a small symbol of what might have been if fear and misunderstanding hadn't overwhelmed the fragile bridges being built between different ways of being human. The fieldwork would continue for another month, yielding insights that would reshape understanding of early human interactions. Papers would be published in prestigious journals. Conferences would buzz with discussions of contact between species. Documentaries would attempt to reconstruct the meeting that had ended so badly. But none of it would capture the essential truth, that in this cave, two branches of humanity had briefly touched each other's dreams and found them not so different after all. That love and curiosity and hope had existed here alongside the violence, that the failure had been one of communication rather than fundamental incompatibility. The bones would be catalogued, measured, analyzed, and eventually displayed in museums where millions of visitors would file past them with expressions of respectful interest. The story would become part of the human heritage, another chapter in the long narrative of survival and extinction, adaptation and loss. But the deeper story, the one written in laughter shared across linguistic barriers, in gifts offered between strangers, in the brief moment when two peoples had glimpsed the possibility of becoming one, that story would remain forever unreadable, preserved only in the whispered memory of stones and the patient dreams of Earth itself. They would call them Neanderthals, these patient bones, but they would never truly know the night that had bound all of humanity together in hope and sorrow, the meeting that had failed, but whose failure had somehow made possible everything that came after. The names were lost, but the love that had briefly bloomed between the speaking stones lived on, invisible but indestructible, woven into the very fabric of what it meant to be human, beneath the vast and starlit sky. Listen. In the spaces between heartbeats, in the pause between one breath and the next, in the silence that falls when the wind holds its peace there, if you know how to listen, you can hear it still. The echo of that ancient fire, the one that burned between two peoples, who might have been one if time had been kinder, if fear had been weaker, if understanding had been stronger than the shadows cast by ignorance. I am the voice that remembers when no one else can remember. I am the whisper that carries stories older than written words, deeper than archaeological layers, more persistent than stone. I have watched the slow dance of continents, felt the rise and fall of ice ages, witnessed the endless parade of species as they bloom and fade, and sometimes, rarely, transcend their origins to become something neither earth nor sky had dared to dream. And I remember that night, the night when fire died in a cave full of sorrow, when two streams of humanity flowed apart never to meet again in their original forms, when the future split into paths that would wander for millennia before finding their way back to each other. But here is the secret that the bones cannot tell, that science cannot measure, that even the most careful archaeology cannot uncover. Every fire that has burned since that night carries something of that first flame. Every light kindled in darkness, every warmth shared against the cold, every spark struck from stone to drive back the shadows. All of them remember the gift that Kalan offered to Asher in the space between their worlds. In the hearths of ancient villages, where children learned their first lessons in survival and community, the echo lived. In the forges where bronze was born and iron was tamed, where metal learned to serve human dreams of tools and weapons and art. In the lanterns that lit the first libraries, where knowledge began its long journey, from mouth, to written word, to printed page, to the infinite networks of light that would one day span the globe, the fire remembered, through all the ages of expansion and exploration, as Asher's people carried their patient wisdom deeper into the hidden places of the world, as Kalan's people spread their restless curiosity across every landscape the earth offered, the echo traveled with them. In every camp where strangers met and chose trust over suspicion, in every moment when different cultures reached across the gaps of language and custom to find common ground, the ancient flame flickered back to life. Sometimes it failed, as it had failed that first time. Sometimes fear proved stronger than hope, misunderstanding more powerful than the will to understand. Wars were fought, peoples displaced, entire ways of life erased by those who could not see past surface differences to the deeper kinship that connected all who walked upright beneath the same sky. But the echo persisted, waiting for its moment, keeping alive the memory of what was possible when two peoples chose to offer fire to each other instead of using it as a weapon. And slowly, so slowly that no single lifetime could perceive it, the scattered children of that broken meeting began to find their way back to each other. Not as separate species meeting across impossible gulfs of difference, but as variations on a single theme, different notes in the same vast song of becoming human in a universe that was stranger and more wonderful than any of them could fully comprehend. The Neanderthal blood lived on, woven into the genetic tapestry of those who came after, carrying with it the gifts of patience and deep knowing, the ability to find home in the heart of winter, to kindle warmth where none existed, to understand that sometimes the greatest strength lay in staying rather than going, in depth rather than distance. The sapiens' spirit lived on too, the hunger for horizons, the dissatisfaction with simple answers, the restless drive to explore and question, and push beyond every boundary that seemed absolute. From them came the courage to risk everything for the possibility of finding something better, the willingness to leave the known for the unknown, to trade security for discovery. And in the marriage of these gifts, depth and reach, patience and urgency, the wisdom of roots and the courage of wings, something new was born. A people capable of both profound stability and radical change, both careful preservation and bold transformation. They learned to make fire from substances that had never burned, to speak across distances that would have taken their ancestors' lifetimes to travel, to preserve knowledge in forms that could outlast entire civilizations. They built structures that reached toward the stars and machines that thought with the speed of lightning. They unlocked the secrets hidden in the heart of matter, mapped the patterns written in their own blood, reached beyond the boundaries of their own world, to touch other worlds, orbiting distant suns. But through it all, through every triumph and transformation, the echo of that first fire remained. In the laboratories where they learned to heal diseases that had plagued humanity since its beginning, in the concert halls where they created beauty that made the aurora itself seem simple, in the classrooms where they taught their children to see wonder in everything from the dance of atoms to the birth of galaxies everywhere, the ancient flame burned on. And sometimes, in moments of perfect clarity, they could feel it, the connection to those who had come before, the debt they owed to the ones who had failed, so that their failure could become the foundation for eventual success. In the quiet moments between great achievements, in the pauses between one discovery and the next, they would remember not consciously, perhaps, but in the deep places of memory that genetics carries from generation to generation. They were the children of the cave, the inheritors of both victory and defeat, of hope and tragedy, of love attempted and temporarily lost but never truly abandoned. They carried within themselves the echo of voices speaking across differences of language and culture, the warmth of fire shared between strangers, the bitter knowledge that understanding was possible but never guaranteed, always fragile, always requiring conscious choice and continuous effort. Every time they reached across the space between themselves and others unlike them, every time they chose curiosity over fear, every time they offered warmth instead of weapons, they were lighting the fire that had died in that ancient cave and bringing it back to life in forms that Asher and Kalen could never have imagined, but would have recognized as the fulfillment of their deepest hopes. The echo grows, stronger now, in these days when the children of Earth have finally learned to see their world as one place under one sky, when they speak in voices that span continents and share knowledge at the speed of thought. The old divisions are fading, not the beautiful differences that make each culture a unique note in the great symphony, but the barriers that once seemed insurmountable, the gaps that fear had carved between people who forgot they were all part of the same vast family. And sometimes, on clear nights, when the aurora dances across the polar sky, in colors that have no names, when the wind carries the scent of wood smoke and the promise of snow, you can almost hear them. The voices of those who came before, Ashar, singing the old songs beside the thermal springs where her people found their peace. Kalen telling stories around fires built in temporary camps as his people followed their endless roads toward tomorrow, both of them speaking the same truth in different words. That fire shared is life shared, that every flame kindled in darkness pushes back the boundaries of night, that love interrupted is not love destroyed, but love waiting for its proper moment to bloom again. The echo of fire lives on in every heart that chooses hope over despair, connection over isolation, the difficult work of understanding over the easy refuge of fear. It burns in every home where children learn that different does not mean enemy, in every laboratory where knowledge is freely shared, in every spacecraft carrying human dreams toward the infinite mystery of stars. Listen, breathe, feel the warmth that connects you to every fire ever kindled, every light ever struck from darkness, every moment when one human being reached toward another, across whatever gulf seemed to separate them, and discovered that the reaching itself was enough to begin building the bridge. The fire remembers. The earth remembers. The stars themselves remember the night when two peoples almost learned to be one, and the long, patient work of making that almost into always. And in that remembering, in that endless echo of ancient flame, the future continues to unfold, warmer and brighter, and more full of possibility, with each moment when the children of the cave choose light over darkness, love over fear, the hard work of understanding over the easy sleep of forgetting. The echo fades now into silence, into the space between one story and the next, between one breath and another, between the end of what was and the beginning of what might yet be. But it never truly ends. Like energy that can neither be created nor destroyed, but only transformed, the echo of that first fire lives on in every flame that burns, every heart that hopes, every hand that reaches across the spaces between us toward the infinite possibility of becoming, together, more than we could ever be alone. Listen, the fire remembers, and it burns still,